Hello, everyone. Welcome to Being Patient's live talk. This is Nicholas, reporter with Being Patient, and today we'll be speaking with Dale Rivard, who's 64 years old, and we'll be speaking about his diagnosis and his journey of living with mild cognitive impairment. And he was diagnosed in 2017 at the age of 59. So, Dale, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your story.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So Dale, let's start with speaking a little bit about your professional background as a former prosecutor. Tell us a little bit about your career.
Um, I I've been lucky, I have to say. You know, I have farmed for a few years. I worked in management, and then I went to law school later in life. Um, and I was able to um, start with the state's attorney's office. I loved what I did. Some people, you know, uh, really don't find out what they really want to do. But I was so blessed because I loved what I did. I worked in, I worked for, well, representing the state of North Dakota, but I worked in more of the civil division. I also did some criminal work as well. But so I worked for, um, I did a little bit of child support. I did commitment of sexually dangerous individuals, planning and zoning. I I, I did juvenile law. I termination of parental rights. Um, I guess CHIPS cases. It was just a wide variety. And then as I got further on, of course, then I had other attorneys report to me as well in the civil division. But it was so fantastic. I worked with the best people, um, and the judges. I was just, I loved what I did. I mean, I tell people that, and they, and I think everyone kind of just says, oh, okay, yeah. But for me, I mean, um, uh, being a trial attorney was my life. I mean, even on the weekends, I would make sure that I was on call in case something would happen. I'd be one of the first ones to go for a search warrant. I would I'd go on vacation, and after, I always say, oh God, it'd be so nice to get away for a while. After a day or two, I'd be calling the office, trying to figure out how my cases were going, what's next. I I was always on, and but I loved it. I loved it. This is what I was. So it was I was really blessed in order to find an occupation that I truly enjoyed.
What was it about being a prosecutor or trial attorney that you loved the most?
It was always different. It always changes. Some attorneys never go to court. I was in court every day. I either had hearings or I had trials. I love the atmosphere. Um, I love working with the judges, and of course, even the defense attorneys. Some of my best friends were defense attorneys. This is, it's a different world, but it was just so involving, you know, and I had such great secretaries, um, and the attorneys I worked with in the office. I had the state's attorney. I was really lucky to have a couple of the best state's attorneys I've ever met, and they let me basically control my cases. I did whatever I needed to do. And if I wanted to be on any committees in drafting any legislation, I was able to do that, for the state of North Dakota, especially with juvenile law. So it was just such a wonderful experience, a lot of freedom, and well, a lot of responsibility too. But it was great. It was working with these people. It was just fantastic.
Mm. And I'm sure that your diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, the ultimate diagnosis impacted your career. And I just wonder, what was that like, describe to us, like, what was that like for you? Like, what were some of like the early symptoms of mild cognitive impairment that you began to notice, whether it be like in your career or like in your personal life?
Well, what for me, what finally did it is I fell on the ice and I hit my head. And however I got to work, I have no idea. But at work, I collapsed and they brought me to the hospital. And they did a lot of tests and they couldn't quite figure out what was wrong. And I started having this fog, which would come over me. And I couldn't get rid of this fog, and I was dizzy, and we couldn't figure out or determine what was actually going on. So they referred me to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. And after a lot of tests and numerous brain scans, then they made that determination of mild cognitive impairment. At that point, the neurologist came in. I remember coming into the office and he looked at me and he said, you have mild cognitive impairment. So naturally I said, well, mild, that's nothing. What do I need to do? You got some drugs? And no, he said, no, you don't quite understand. It's for him, it was a question of a prelude to Alzheimer's. And he said, your career is over, effective today. You are done. And I said, well, I don't quite understand. And he said, no, ethically, you can't practice law. And so I came back to told my employer and the county that I was done. That was completely devastating. My life was law. This is what this is what I was. When all of a sudden you wake up and you no longer go to the office, and before people would be calling all the time, and then it just stopped. It was pretty devastating. But I look back and I knew things were wrong, but as my neurologist said, what happened was that when you fell, and struck your head, it was probably coming on, and it just kind of hastened the decline. But anyway, I knew things were going wrong. I started to write down before I'd have my hearings, who would be in the courtroom, the name of the judge, the defense attorney. If I had a legal assistant next to me that I'd be training, or another attorney, I'd write their name down because I couldn't remember their names. And I look back at it, it was kind of embarrassing, but I knew I was having problems, couldn't remember names. But these were people that I see every day that I couldn't remember their names. And then I was always prepared. So it got to the point where I'd do the entire hearing or the trial. I'd have it on yellow pads, but I knew what I was going to say and where I was going to go. It was just like, it was Post-its everywhere, to kind of just jog my memory. So towards the end, I was struggling. I knew it. Maybe I didn't know it. I knew something was going on, but I didn't know what it was. So I look back at it, and I was having problems before that.
You falling on the ice, that was like the last straw. And
that was the last straw. That's what my neurologist told me. He said this just kind of pushed everything over. And after that, then I started having that fog, and the fog was terrible, and then your balance is very, I used to ride a bike. We have a greenway, which lasts it's about 8 miles. And I would have no problem. I love going on that. It's about 35, 40 minutes, just out, up, down. Now I can't even ride a bike without falling over. And it's different. It's different.
So how did your colleagues, how did your family, and how did your friends react when
it's so odd because there is a stigma about this, and I guess maybe that's one of the reasons that I'm here, is I want to erase that stigma, because there's a lot of people like me that live with it. For my colleagues, there's a couple that remained in touch, but not very many. It was this feeling like they didn't want to get too close. They didn't want to talk to me. There was this feeling like they might get it, like you got some kind of communicable disease. I mean, these are intelligent people. They know it's not true, but it's just this feeling out there, or they feel that you're less of a person because of it. And for my family, well, I remember on the way home from Mayo, driving home, and my wife and I cried the entire 6 hours home, because it was so devastating, because this is the end. I didn't know, and especially that first 6 months after my diagnosis, I declined a lot. I didn't think I'd be alive for, I wouldn't make it a year. And but lo and behold, with some of the drugs and the kind of help with the symptoms and the support I've had, I'm still here. I'm just amazed. And it just kind of plateaued to a point where we're kind of maintaining and trying to maintain as much as possible.
Right. And I want to touch on your point about the support that's helped you. But before we do, I just want to talk quickly a little bit about, how, you've been going to the doctors to see, whether is this Alzheimer's, or is this Lewy body, or is this frontotemporal dementia? Like, take us through that process.
Well, at first, my first neurologist, he was a nice man, but he explained to me, he said, well, and I said, well, how soon do I actually, get Alzheimer's? Because he thought it was, the beginning. And he said, well, I really can't tell you, but, every year it increases by 10%. So it doesn't look good for you. So he's told me to get my affairs in order, and he said goodbye, which, so be it, but after a couple of years.
Sorry, Dale, so to clarify, so the neurologist who diagnosed you with MCI thought that it's likely that you would progress to Alzheimer's dementia.
Yes. But we continued to have PET scans, and there wasn't much of a change, except for my speech. So then he referred me to another neurologist, who was, I guess, he was really great. And he did absolutely everything he could possibly think of. He still is, to make my life as full as possible, but also to hopefully come up with a formal diagnosis. Because then he thought, well, maybe you're going into Lewy body because of my hallucinations and some of my sleep habits, and then made the determination that it wasn't. And then most recently, he thought it was back to what we're looking at, progressing into Alzheimer's. But he says, I can't make that determination as of yet, and a radiologist that did my last MRI had mentioned, put in his notes that it's the beginning of frontal temporal dementia, but we haven't made a formal diagnosis. Whatever it is, it really doesn't matter. um, we all know where it's going, and it's progressing. So for me, the biggest problem that I do have is probably my speech, and it has affected my speech a lot, finding words, and being in groups, trying to follow conversations, um, even talking with my wife. Um, it's hard because I know what I want to say, I just can't say it. And but as far as um, the short-term memory, I don't think I've progressed. It's progressed too much after the first 6 months. I mean, it's going down. Let's be honest, but it's just different. But my speech is affected my speech more than anything. I can tell you right now.
So the formal diagnosis right now is still
It's
cognitive impairment, but the doctors don't know what is the what's the underlying cause or the
that's
underlying
right.
degenerative disease that's causing the mild cognitive impairment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you've got it.
And
So
so aphasia, your language difficulties is really for you like the main difficulty that you have from the day to day.
well, aphasia,
Yeah.
um, the fog that rolls in, um, you're worn out. Um, it's what happens to me is different than everybody. For me, I'm probably pretty good for a while in the morning, and then I might have to take a nap, and then I reset, and I'll take another, after a while, another nap, and I reset. It just it's hard to function, you know, but I can work around that. These are things that I still am able to still have a full life even with. So
Right. You mentioned that law is your life, and then having to not practice law anymore after the diagnosis. Like, how did you um, approach that after a diagnosis, and how do you continue to live a full life after a diagnosis without law?
well, after I got my diagnosis, I didn't know where to go. So the first thing I did was went online, and I looked up the Alzheimer's Association, and I called them, and it was the best call I ever made. When I called the Alzheimer's Association, there was a singing group that was starting here in Grand Forks, in North Dakota, which is across, just very close to me. And it was called the Unforgettables. So I called and started with the group. I didn't know what it was about. But what I found was that, we get together every once a week, but the first hour or 45 minutes is just talking with other people with Alzheimer's or related dementias that are going through the same thing that I am. And of course, then we sing. The singing is always secondary, but it's this communication and finding other people out there that are having the same or similar problems, and you're sharing information so you don't feel quite so alone. And then also with the Alzheimer's Association, I was lucky enough to be part of a couple of groups, so they keep you active. But I'd have to say, just getting involved with other people in the same situation, it really helps. And then of course I was quite open about it. Some people are very closed, All of a sudden I know people that have a diagnosis and they just go away. Well, it's easy to fall back, to turn on the TV and not participate in life, but it really isn't much fun. You have to push yourself, but by pushing yourself, you still, I think you delay the inevitable, because we all know where it's going. And I want to get as much out of life as I possibly can. I'm lucky enough to have a wonderful wife who supports me, and so, and I have children, so I'm still active that way. So I have been blessed, by having this grounding force that's around me that really helps me in everything that I do. So, and then of course I still try to do as much as possible. Some things I can't, even in church, I've had to give up quite a bit because I'm just unable to do it anymore. But that's okay. I just take it as it comes.
Where you talked about joining the Untouchable, the singing,
The Unforgettables. Yes, not Untouchables. Okay.
Were you a singer before, or?
Oh no. Well, I sang in a church choir maybe for about 6 months when I was 25, but that was about it. So I'm not a singer.
Yeah.
And nobody, well, there's a few of them that used to be pretty good, but most of us are not. It's not that we can't be trained, which is wonderful, but it's you feel so much better, when you talk to other people that are going through the same thing that you are. And even for my wife, it's for people with dementia and their caregivers. It's really tough for the caregivers, as your spouse or your significant other is having problems. So they're talking about how it works, with whoever they're supporting. And I was amazed, in our group, we've had, since it started, we've had more than a few that have passed away, that's what happens. But, some of them, some progress fairly rapidly, some progress fairly slowly. I think with this Alzheimer's and the related dementias, every one of them is different. We're all the same, but everybody's different, and it affects different parts of the brain. So it makes you feel like a part of a community. You're not forgotten.
Yeah, because as you mentioned, just in our brief conversation before this interview, you can feel so alone, right?
Yes, you do. And that's the point. You need to get out there. And my wife's family is wonderful. I love going to see them. They're easy. If they have a question, they'll ask me about it. They're just, they just, you have a disability and you're fine. Some of my other family, not so much. I remember speaking to one family member, and after I was diagnosed, and she comes up to me and she holds my hand and she says, do you remember me? And I said, well, I was over at your place 2 weeks ago. No, but do you remember me? Because I know that you probably can't anymore. And I said, no, it's not quite right now anymore. I still remember you, so you're treated differently, which is kind of sad. That's why hopefully by coming out and telling people that with an early diagnosis, you still can live a full life to a point, which I think is great. Because if you were diagnosed later, boy, that'd be tough. That'd be tough.
And you talk about the stigma, with uh for instance, that experience with your family member, or feeling that distance from some of your colleagues. So, like, on that note, like, what do you think are good ways for for colleagues and families and friends to best support someone who receives a diagnosis of MCI, or Alzheimer's, or the related dementias?
Think of it as a disability, and that's what it is. And that should be thought of as that. Whether you have, if I was thinking about it at work, if someone at work would develop cancer, what can we do for you? Or even at my job, I mean, I still could have done certain things. I wouldn't be able to practice law, but I still could assist other attorneys or getting cases ready, or research. And then there's things you can do. You should try to work around to keep them still active and engaged. We know what's going to happen. We know it's going to progress. But especially at an early diagnosis, I think we need to try to keep them engaged and involved. And I do know that, after talking with a few people, some people have had a diagnosis and they have still been able to continue on with their position, whatever it was, and sometimes with some modifications. And then, as it progresses, you just can't do it. And that's fine, which is wonderful. And I think that the more that you hear about us, that we're out there, and the easier it will become. Even myself, I had my grandmother who had passed away from Alzheimer's, my father who had significant problems. Um, but until I had it, I I thought of it differently, you know, because I keep on thinking of the person in the old folks home or the nursing home looking at a wall, talking to a wall, or just not knowing where they are. Well, that's probably what's going to happen, but it's not going to happen to me until the very end, hopefully. I'll still want to become engaged as much as possible. And especially, you never want to give up hope, because as the new medications or new therapies come out, you can extend your life, you know. So I always want to tell people that there is hope, and to keep on, you know, enjoy life as much as possible, especially when you get this diagnosis. It's devastating. It's just completely devastating. There's nothing worse, because you think about it, and you think about, like I said before, at the nursing home, people that don't know anybody. That's awful. But it's not like that. You can still have a full life until that point.
Yeah, is there any last thoughts that you'd like to add, Dale, that I haven't asked you yet?
No, I guess just once more, just don't give up. You know, um, if you have a diagnosis like this, or if your significant other, your spouse has a diagnosis like this, keep them involved, keep them engaged. Put them out there. They're people. Treat them as people. Just treat them as a normal disability with anybody else. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think one thought that comes up now for me is, I've had people describe how, just, after you receive the diagnosis, you can really descend into a really dark hole, you know, and I think for
Yes,
any,
you go down the rabbit hole of depression. It's terrible.
yeah, and for anyone, I think, or for any disease or illness, like, holding on to hope when you're in that dark hole is very difficult. just wondering, whether you have any thoughts and perspectives or advice for folks who might be in that dark hole in terms of like how can you pull yourself up, in those moments.
Well, for me, besides the group that I was involved with, I had my wife, and she's basically my rock, and I don't think she'd let me get too far in that dark hole. But so knowing that there's someone that's out there that still loves you, it makes a big difference. And of course, I know it sounds odd, but and your faith. And I think I was always pretty strong in my faith, but now even more so. It's like another world that opens up. I no longer think about work or court cases or any of those things. I think more about my family, my church, my children, my grandchildren. It kind of puts everything into perspective. I don't want to tell people this much, but sometimes I think my life is probably even more blessed with the disease than without. I mean, when you're gone from this world, as we all will be, what matters? It doesn't matter about your career or your position. What matters is, have you made a difference in this world? And I've been lucky enough to have some wonderful people around me that hopefully, when I'm gone, they'll think, well, he was a pretty nice guy. I like Grandpa. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dale, for sharing your story and for sharing your insights.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
this was wonderful.
It's my pleasure. And for our audience, if you've missed any parts of this live talk, we'll have a recording uploaded on our YouTube channel, as well as the transcript uploaded into our website. And if you haven't signed up to our newsletter yet, don't forget to do so. Thank you so much, Dale.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.